a contract written in Japanese and smiled. "Translate it, and you'll get my salary." He had no idea who was actually behind the wheel. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The sun had barely begun its slow rise over the hills of Los Angeles, casting long streaks of orange and gold across the glass towers that punctuated the skyline. Downtown shimmered in the distance like a mirage of power and possibility as the streets below began their usual dance of motion. Early risers, delivery trucks, joggers with headphones, and the city's heartbeat rumbling to life. A black Escalade, polished to a mirror finish, glided smoothly along Sunset Boulevard. Inside, climate-controlled comfort and the scent of fresh-roasted Ethiopian coffee created a sharp contrast to the noise and heat outside. Brian Ellerton, the media tycoon whose name graced magazine covers and business columns alike, reclined in the back seat with one leg crossed over the other. He wore a blazer tailored so precisely it barely wrinkled, and sunglasses more expensive than most people's monthly rent. His tablet rested on his knee, his phone buzzed with notifications, and his voice filled the cabin with confident, almost careless authority. Sitting beside him was Diane Wu, the company's general counsel, and Carter Myers, their lead content executive. All three were on their way to the Ellerton Media Tower for a high-stakes meeting with stakeholders following their proposed acquisition of a major AI-driven content startup based in Tokyo. "I swear," Brian was saying with a chuckle, "this contract is written to keep even our best people confused. Look at this. Look at it." He waved the screen toward Diane, who leaned in, scanning the document quickly. "That's not just Japanese. This is specialized tech jargon mixed with old-school legal formatting. Looks like they don't want us reading it too closely," she said, arching an eyebrow. "Exactly," Brian replied, amused. "But we've got top-tier translators on this already. Just for fun, though." He paused, glanced up toward the front of the vehicle. "Hey, Jamal." The driver's eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror, then back to the road. He didn't need to respond. He'd been working for Brian for over a decade. He knew when he was being addressed and when to listen. Brian grinned. "How's your Japanese, Jamal? Think you could translate a couple dozen pages of this thing by tomorrow morning?" The others laughed. Even Carter, who normally didn't crack a smile before his second coffee, snorted at the absurdity. "If you can," Brian continued, clearly enjoying himself, "I'll give you my quarterly bonus. That's what? About 250 grand, give or take." More laughter filled the cabin. It bounced off the leather seats and the chrome trim, echoing back with the sound of superiority and playful cruelty. For Brian, it was a harmless joke. For Diane, a bit tone-deaf maybe, but still harmless. For Carter, pure entertainment. Jamal didn't laugh. He reached back calmly, accepting the printed copy that Brian had waved in the air like a toy. He folded the pages once, placed them neatly on the center console beside him, and said only, "Understood, sir." Brian raised his brows, surprised at the seriousness of the reply. "Well, now I'm intrigued." Diane looked at Jamal through the tinted divider and offered a smile that was equal parts polite and apologetic. "Don't let him get under your skin. He's in a mood." But Jamal's eyes remained on the road. He nodded slightly, and that was the end of it. As they passed through Beverly Hills and approached Century City, the mood inside the vehicle shifted to more serious matters. Conference calls, shareholder expectations, revised talking points, all took center stage. The contract was forgotten, or at least temporarily shelved. Brian leaned back and closed his eyes, trusting the city and his people to behave as expected. He didn't notice the way Jamal glanced down at the folded document during a red light. He didn't wonder whether his driver had understood his words more deeply than he'd imagined. He certainly didn't imagine that the man behind the wheel once stood in front of classrooms lecturing on syntax and semantics. Later that evening, the city had softened into its dusky glow. The Escalade idled quietly in the driveway of Brian's hillside mansion while the last of the guests from an informal investor dinner drifted out. Jamal opened the rear door as Brian stepped out, slightly tipsy but still sharp, still riding high from the day's success. "You still got that paper?" Brian asked, laughing again. "Bring it back tomorrow, huh? Let's see what you come up with." "Yes, sir," Jamal replied. He waited until the doors of the house closed before stepping back into the car. For a moment, he sat motionless, hands resting on the steering wheel. The city twinkled below, wide and indifferent. Then he reached over to the passenger seat, took the contract in hand, and opened it under the dome light. The text was dense, not just standard Japanese business language, but packed with references to specific semiconductor architectures, proprietary encryption methods, and joint ownership models. It was the kind of document designed to overwhelm even fluent readers, especially those unfamiliar with both law and technology. But to Jamal, it was something else. It was a challenge. He didn't go home immediately. Instead, he drove to the small public library off Crenshaw, the one that stayed open late 3 nights a week. He took out his old leather notebook, the one that hadn't left its shelf in years, and laid the contract out on the desk beneath the fluorescent light. The librarian, who recognized him from the neighborhood, gave him a quiet nod and didn't ask questions. Hours passed. He translated the first paragraph slowly, writing notes by hand, then typing a more formal version into a Word document. He consulted online dictionaries, academic glossaries he hadn't used in a decade, and linguistic databases once familiar like home. It all came back. Not instantly, but like a tide rolling in, steady and unstoppable. He returned to his apartment just after midnight. It was small, 1 bedroom, no frills, but spotless, organized with military precision. His books were shelved by language. His clothes were folded with care. On the wall above his desk, a photograph of a smiling young boy. His nephew back in Ghana looked down at him. Jamal sat at his desk and began again. He translated until 3 in the morning. He paused only to drink water and stretch his fingers. He made annotations in the margins, circling what looked like minor clauses but weren't. Subtleties that transferred intellectual rights, rerouted digital access points, buried under layers of translation and jargon. He read a section twice, then a third time, and finally leaned back in his chair. His stomach turned. The contract, if executed, wouldn't just be a poor deal. It would be a disaster. The Tokyo partner would gain irrevocable access to Ellerton Media's data infrastructure, AI models, user behavior analytics, content IP, everything. It was cloaked in harmless language, but Jamal knew what it meant. Because once, long ago, before everything collapsed, he taught others to spot such things. The next morning, he ironed his shirt and polished his shoes with the same care as always. The contract was printed and placed neatly in a folder. He arrived at Brian's home at precisely 7 a.m., as he did every weekday. Brian didn't come out until nearly 9. Hungover, sluggish, grinning at something on his phone. He slid into the back seat and muttered, "Let's stop at Alfred's on the way in. I need something to kill this headache." Jamal said nothing. As the Escalade pulled out onto Mulholland Drive, the city stretched before them once more. Golden, sprawling, hungry. Jamal reached into his case and handed Brian the folder over his shoulder. "What's this?" Brian asked, sipping from his bottle of smart water. "The translation," Jamal said. Brian chuckled. "You're joking." "I'm not." He flipped the folder open casually, then stopped. He began to read. At first, his eyes skimmed, then they slowed. His brow furrowed. He adjusted in his seat. Jamal kept driving. Mile by mile, block by block, towards something that neither man had seen coming. Brian said nothing for the next 10 minutes. The only sound in the cabin of the Escalade was the muted rumble of the engine and the distant hum of traffic. He turned pages with increasing urgency, his previously relaxed posture gone, replaced with stiff attention and a quiet disbelief that hovered just behind his shifting eyes. Jamal didn't glance back. He kept his focus on the road, navigating seamlessly through the intersections of Santa Monica Boulevard, the kind of professional who never missed a turn even when the world shifted behind him. When they arrived at the Ellerton Media Building, Brian didn't exit immediately. He sat still for a long moment, then finally looked up from the folder, his mouth opening to speak, but then closing again. He stepped out without a word. Jamal pulled the vehicle into the private underground garage and parked. As the engine cooled into silence, he exhaled and finally allowed himself a blink longer than necessary. The weight of the morning hadn't lifted. It was just beginning. That evening, back in his apartment, Jamal removed his shoes with practiced care and placed them by the door on the rubber mat. The air inside was cool, a quiet hum from the wall unit in the living room. He didn't turn on any lights. He walked directly to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and drank it slowly, eyes resting on the stack of paper on his desk. The translated contract still sat there, a second copy he had printed just in case. He had annotated it again after returning home, underlining passages he knew no one else would catch. Then he walked to the bookshelf beside the window and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. It was worn around the edges, the pages slightly curled from years of being stored, used, opened, closed, then forgotten. Inside were names, dates, concepts in various languages: Japanese, French, Swahili, Korean, diagrams from old lectures, handwritten outlines of lessons once given to students who listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions. Those days felt like another lifetime, yet they had only been 10 years ago. He opened a page and slowly wrote down several terms from the contract. He translated them again, once literally, then contextually, then legally, layer by layer, as if stripping away the armor of corporate obfuscation. As he wrote, the words came easier. His fingers began to move faster. The rhythm returned. Once, in Nairobi, he had taught a class titled Semantic Ambiguity in Legal Technical Japanese. It had been a popular seminar, attended not only by students of language but also by early career law professionals, engineers, even diplomats. He had explained how specific clauses in East Asian contracts often relied on the reader's assumed knowledge of both commercial law and technical systems, a perfect camouflage for manipulation. At the time, he had used fictional examples. Now it was real. Jamal sat back in his chair and stared at the wall. His mind drifted not to Brian or the company, but to the final day he'd lectured. It had been raining that morning. He'd walked across the quadrangle at the university, briefcase in hand, while several of his students waited outside the lecture hall. They had greeted him warmly, one of them handing him a cup of tea from the campus canteen. Later that afternoon, he received the warning call. His colleague, a former classmate from graduate school, told him not to return home. The state police had detained several professors that morning, people who had spoken critically, even subtly, about the shifting regime. One had disappeared. Another, a linguist like him, had been charged with intent to undermine state cohesion. A manufactured term. Jamal never taught again. He gathered what documents he could, contacted his sister in Ghana to arrange a temporary escape route, and used a fast-expiring visa tied to a canceled academic conference in San Diego to enter the United States. Everything he had built was left behind. Research, students, identity. In Los Angeles, things moved quickly. Shelter came first, then a job, any job. His accent, his polished grammar, even his professional demeanor ironically worked against him. People didn't know what to make of him. Overqualified for minimum wage work, underdocumented for anything requiring licensing. A friend of a friend connected him to a high-end car service agency. That was where he first met Brian. Back then, Brian had been different, less powerful, still on his rise. He was brash, but not cruel. Jamal remembered thinking that he was young, impatient, ambitious, qualities he had once seen in his own students. At the time, the job had felt temporary, just a phase before something opened up. But weeks became months, and months became years. Eventually, Jamal stopped checking faculty listings or contacting old colleagues. His phone's contact list with their names sat untouched, their numbers slowly deactivating or becoming unreachable. He had vanished on purpose. There was a certain safety in invisibility. When no one asked questions, no one exposed your past. No one knew where your family lived. No one could use you as leverage. But there was a price, and Jamal had paid it. Every time Brian cracked a joke without thinking, every time he was asked to wait outside in the car during meetings, every time people spoke around him, not to him, as though he were furniture. He stared now at the photo of his nephew on the desk. The boy had just turned 17. He wanted to study medicine. Jamal had promised to help pay for his entrance exam preparation next year. That check from Brian could cover the entire tuition, perhaps more. He reached for his phone and opened his messages. He scrolled until he found a familiar name. Dr. Stephanie Okoye, his younger sister. He hadn't spoken to her in several weeks beyond their usual financial updates and photos of her son. He typed, "It's me. I have something serious I need your opinion on. A contract in Japanese. Very technical. Something doesn't feel right about it. Can you spare a few minutes tonight?" She replied within 20 minutes. "Of course. Send it over. Let me take a look." He attached the scan and hit send. Then, while waiting, he opened a new file and began writing a detailed summary. He explained what he suspected, how the clauses were structured, how the transfer of rights was hidden within innocuous language. He included references to similar cases he had studied in the past. After finishing, he leaned back again and let the hum of the apartment fill the silence. The reply came at 1:23 a.m. "You're not imagining things. This contract is a Trojan horse. If it goes through as is, they'll have the skeleton key to the company's entire infrastructure. This kind of language is deliberate, sophisticated, and dangerous." She paused before sending another message. "Are you in danger?" He looked at the question for a long time, then typed, "No, not yet, but I may be seen." Stephanie's reply was measured. "Do what you have to. Just don't forget who you are." Jamal didn't sleep that night. He finished annotating the full contract, wrote a secondary document with flagged sections, and saved everything in multiple encrypted backups. By the time the sky began to lighten through his kitchen window, he had showered, ironed his shirt again, and packed his bag. At 6:55 a.m., he stood beside the Escalade, keys in hand, waiting for the gate to Brian's property to slide open. He knew what was coming. He didn't know what it would mean. The morning unfolded under a sky scrubbed clear by the ocean breeze, sharp and blue over the Los Angeles skyline. The air had a crispness to it, unusual for late spring, but welcome. Jamal arrived at the Ellerton residence precisely at 6:55 a.m., as always. He had washed the car that morning, wiped the windows, even checked the tire pressure. It was habit, yes, but also ritual. A sense of control before stepping once again into the orbit of power. The gates opened without fanfare. The driveway wound through manicured hedges and flower beds arranged with geometric precision. The house itself sat like a declaration of wealth. Glass, stone, and exposed steel. A minimalist palace built not for comfort, but for stature. Jamal parked where he always did, stepped out, opened the rear door, and waited. At 7:41 a.m., Brian finally appeared. He looked rumpled, though not unkempt. His blazer hung unbuttoned over a soft gray tee, and dark sunglasses shielded his eyes. In one hand, he held his ever-present phone. In the other, a bottle of designer water. He moved with the lazy grace of someone used to the world waiting for him. As he slid into the back seat, he muttered something about needing coffee and leaned back with a sigh. "Let's stop at Alfred's," he said. "I can't face numbers without caffeine." Jamal acknowledged with a simple nod and eased the vehicle down the driveway, merging smoothly into the morning flow of traffic. For the first few blocks, Brian remained engrossed in his phone, scrolling, answering emails with clipped texts. The vehicle moved through intersections and past familiar landmarks in silence, the kind that could only exist between people who spent every day together and yet knew next to nothing about one another. Then, without looking up, Brian reached forward and tapped the back of Jamal's seat with his knuckles. "You got that translation thing?" he asked, his voice casual, still clearly expecting a laugh and a shrug. Jamal reached into his bag, withdrew the slim blue folder, and extended it backward without turning around. Brian took it with one hand and flipped it open with the practiced indifference of a man who reviewed dozens of documents daily. He didn't expect anything. A prank, maybe. A few Google translated phrases followed by a polite refusal. Instead, he turned to the first page and stared. His fingers stopped moving. There was a long pause. Then a quiet, "Huh?" The pages whispered as he turned them. First one, then another. His eyes scanned faster, then slower. His breathing changed. The car's interior remained unchanged. Same temperature, same hum of traffic muffled behind thick glass. But something had shifted. Something was happening. By the time they reached Sunset Plaza, Brian had sat upright. His phone lay forgotten beside him. He turned back to page 3 and reread it. Then, with a sudden sharpness in his voice, he said, "Where did you get this?" Jamal glanced in the rearview mirror but didn't meet his eyes. "I translated it, sir." Brian stared. This is real?" "Yes, sir." For a moment, Brian didn't respond. Then he leaned forward between the seats and said, "Pull over, now." Jamal turned onto a quiet side street and stopped the vehicle beside a boutique hotel. Brian unbuckled, folder in hand, and stepped out without another word. He began pacing the sidewalk, flipping back through the translation. His lips moved, murmuring phrases under his breath, and then he pulled out his phone. Jamal sat still, engine running, hands on the wheel. Within minutes, Diane Wu and Carter Myers were on a conference call. Brian spoke quickly, reading out passages from the translation, demanding that their in-house legal team pull up the original document and re-examine the flagged sections. On the line, someone else, a lawyer with a sharper voice, confirmed the existence of the problematic clauses. One dealt with irrevocable data access granted to the Tokyo Partners cloud management subsidiary. Another subtly transferred future ownership rights of co-developed algorithms. Carter cursed. Diane demanded a copy immediately. Brian, for once, didn't seem smug. His face had gone pale beneath his sunglasses. He got back in the car, not into the back seat, but into the front passenger seat, slamming the door. "Drive," he said. "To the tower?" "No, take me home, now." Jamal obeyed. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Brian rubbed his jaw, stared out the window, then finally looked over. "How the hell did you read that?" "I'm fluent in Japanese," Jamal said simply. "No, not just fluent. You understood the technical language. You understood the legal framing." "Yes." Brian's voice lowered. "Who are you?" The question hung in the air like a needle against glass. Jamal didn't answer. "I mean it," Brian continued. "You're not a translator who moonlights as a driver. You're not someone who picked up some Japanese off Rosetta Stone. This is professional work. I've paid consultants 6 figures who don't catch this stuff." Still, Jamal said nothing. They arrived at Brian's estate. Jamal parked in the shade as the gates closed behind them. Brian didn't get out right away. He sat in silence, folder in hand, his expression shifting from confusion to calculation, then something else. Uncertainty, embarrassment. Jamal waited. Finally, Brian spoke. "I owe you an apology." "You don't," Jamal replied. Brian turned. "No, I do. For what I said yesterday, for what I've probably said dozens of times without thinking. I never thought—" He trailed off. Jamal looked straight ahead. "You didn't need to." That struck deeper than Brian expected. He opened his mouth and shut it again. He opened the door and stepped out. "Come in," he said, almost reluctantly. "We need to talk." Jamal followed. Inside the house, the chill of the interior was exaggerated by silence. No music, no assistants, no background television. Brian walked to his study, the same room where he had once tossed the contract at Jamal like a piece of scrap paper. Now, he stood at the same desk and placed the folder down gently. "You saved the company," he said quietly. "That deal was going through in 2 days. No one saw the trap." Jamal looked at the high shelves, the polished wood, the art that cost more than his apartment building. He didn't speak. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you money. I owe you recognition. A place here. In the company. Not—" Brian waved vaguely. "Not in the garage." Jamal's jaw tightened. "I need none of that." Brian stepped forward. "Then why help me?" Jamal finally met his eyes. "Because I work here. What happens to this company affects every person who depends on it, including me." Brian exhaled, hands on his hips. "So that's it? You're just going to disappear again?" Jamal didn't answer. Brian walked to a cabinet, pulled out a bottle of whiskey, thought better of it, and pushed it aside. "I want to know who you are." "I was a professor of linguistics," Jamal said after a moment. "I taught Japanese language and comparative semantics. I wrote papers, gave lectures. Then my government collapsed. People like me, people with voices, became dangerous. I left. I came here." Brian swallowed. "And no one ever asked?" "No," Jamal said. "Not once." Brian sat down slowly. "Jesus." There was no anger in Jamal's voice, no accusation, only a quiet resignation. The conversation could have ended there, but it didn't. Brian stood again, restless, agitated, humbled. He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a checkbook. "My quarterly bonus. You earned it." Jamal shook his head. "It's unnecessary." "It's necessary to me." Jamal hesitated, then accepted the check. Not for pride, not for victory, but because it could build something beyond this house, beyond this city, something back home. Brian looked at him. I want you to work with our legal division. Off the books, if you prefer. You see things none of us do. You have experience none of us have. We need that. Jamal considered. The idea of returning to that world, even quietly, even hidden, stirred something he hadn't let himself feel in years. I'd need guarantees. Name them. Jamal spoke clearly, firmly. Anonymity, flexible hours, and respect. No more jokes. Not for me. Not for anyone on your staff. Brian didn't flinch. He nodded once. You have my word. The room fell silent again. This time, not from tension, but from recognition. Two men, one separated by layers of assumption, sat in the same space with the same understanding. Jamal stood. I should finish my shift. Brian offered no argument. He only said, Thank you. Jamal nodded, then left the room, the heavy door closing behind him. The sound echoed not like an end, but a beginning. The next morning, Jamal arrived earlier than usual. The sun had only just begun to rise over the ridge of the hills when he pulled into the drive. The Ellerton estate was still quiet, wrapped in the hush of an early hour, its windows dark, its shadows long across the polished stone. He didn't honk. He didn't signal. He waited, as he always did, in silence. The Escalade idled softly, the faint vibration of the engine the only sound in a world momentarily still. At 7:15 a.m., the front door opened. Brian emerged alone, carrying no phone, no tablet, no coffee. He wore a simple sweater, no blazer. His hair was slightly tousled, his face unshaven. He walked towards the car, not with his usual briskness, but at a slower, more measured pace, and instead of climbing into the back seat, he opened the passenger door in front and sat beside Jamal without a word. Jamal looked over, just briefly, and then pulled the vehicle forward. The quiet between them stretched. The glass divider that had always separated them remained retracted, a silent acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. Brian spoke first. I didn't sleep much last night, he said, his voice low and without its usual bravado. Kept thinking about yesterday, about you, about everything I don't know. Jamal kept his eyes on the road. Brian continued. I realized something. In all the years I've known you, or thought I did, I never once asked you where you're from. Not really. Never asked who you were before this. Jamal didn't answer right away. They turned onto Mulholland Drive, the road curving along the ridge of the hills, revealing a panoramic view of the valley below. The city stretched wide and glittering in the early light. My name, Jamal said finally, is Jamal Adewale Okoye. I was born in Lagos, but I spent most of my adult life in Nairobi. Brian nodded slowly. And you were a professor? Yes, at the University of Nairobi, Department of Linguistics. I taught Japanese language and comparative syntax, mostly in the context of East Asian legal structures. Brian let out a quiet laugh, not out of amusement, but disbelief. You're telling me that all this time, my driver, was someone with a doctorate in language and law. I was many things, Jamal said. Before. What happened? Jamal took a slow breath. Political unrest, new administration. They began cracking down on academia, especially anyone who was outspoken. Even neutral topics became suspect. I was warned by a colleague that I was on a list. I had 3 hours to leave the city before the security police came to my home. Brian looked over, stunned. I had a visa for a canceled conference in San Diego. It was enough to get me into the United States. I left behind everything, my home, my research, my name. You couldn't find work here? In your field? Jamal's jaw tightened. My credentials didn't transfer. My records were left behind. To revalidate them would have required years of time and money. I needed to earn immediately. I needed to survive. My sister was already in the States, but she was in no position to support me. Driving was the first work I could find. Brian was quiet for a long moment. And then you met me. I did. Brian shook his head slowly. Jesus. They drove on. The road dipped and climbed, winding through neighborhoods of affluence. Palm trees lined the streets like sentinels. Jamal turned onto Benedict Canyon, moving slowly past the gates and high hedges that concealed lives built on deals and legacies. I need to ask you something, Brian said, his voice still subdued. Why didn't you ever say anything? Why stay silent all these years? Jamal gripped the wheel a little tighter. Because it was safer. Because anonymity is protection. Because people with stories like mine learn quickly that being seen can be dangerous. And because in your world, I wasn't supposed to exist. Brian winced. That's not fair. It's not, Jamal said, but it's true. They drove in silence again. A deeper silence this time, one that filled the space between them not with discomfort but with reckoning. Jamal had always been composed, disciplined, unreadable, but now, with each word, the man Brian had seen as background came into clearer focus. I want to make this right, Brian said eventually. You saved me, my company, everything. I need you to be part of it now. Officially. Jamal didn't respond. I understand if you don't trust me, Brian added quickly, but I'm not asking out of guilt. I'm asking because we need you. The business needs someone who can see what you saw. We've been arrogant, blind. You're not just good. You're better than anyone on my team. Jamal's eyes flicked to him and back to the road. You're offering me a job? Yes, consultant, international strategy, legal linguistic analysis, whatever title you want. Flexible terms, whatever protects you and your family. Jamal was quiet for a long time. I have conditions, he said finally. Brian straightened. Of course, anything. Anonymity, Jamal said. My work must not be public. I still have family abroad. They could be targeted if I become visible. Done. Flexible hours. I won't work in your office. I won't report daily. Fine. And respect, Jamal added. For me, for everyone who works for you. No more jokes, no more theater at other people's expense. Brian flushed. You're right. I've been careless, entitled. I let the culture at the top become a mirror of my own worst instincts. I didn't see it because I never had to. You've shown me that. You have my word. It will change. They reached a red light at the base of the hill. Brian stared straight ahead, blinking against the light, then turned back to Jamal. Why now? He asked. Why reveal yourself now? Jamal's voice was steady. Because you were about to walk into a trap. Because this company employs thousands of people who would have lost everything. And because, maybe, I was ready to stop hiding. Brian exhaled. Then let's do this. Properly. Together. Jamal didn't smile, but the set of his shoulders changed. Just slightly. At the next turn, Brian pulled out his phone and sent a message. Diane's preparing the paperwork, he said. We'll structure it under a private contractor model. No HR file, no public announcement. Your name will only appear on restricted legal documents. Jamal nodded. That works. They arrived at the office tower just before 9. The parking garage echoed as Jamal pulled into Brian's reserved space. For the first time in years, Brian didn't wait to be let out. He stepped from the car, closed the door himself, then turned back. Thank you, he said again, not just for what you did, but for who you are. Jamal met his gaze. You're welcome. Brian disappeared into the elevator. Jamal remained in the car, hands resting on the wheel, mind not yet settled. Back at his apartment that evening, Jamal sat down at his desk and unfolded the check. The number glared up at him, more than he had ever held at one time. He thought of his nephew's dream of medical school, of his sister's aging parents-in-law, of the repairs needed on the family home in Accra. He took a pen and carefully endorsed the back, then placed it into the deposit envelope he had prepared earlier. He didn't open the tab on his laptop for another hour. When he finally did, he began reading a new contract. This time, one from a Korean startup Brian's team had recently engaged with. It was long, tangled, and filled with beautiful, deceptive language. Exactly the kind of thing he was now being paid to read. And this time, he would read every word. 3 months passed like the slow turning of a page. Not with a dramatic flourish, but quietly, subtly. Days stacking one atop another until the man who once sat behind the wheel every morning found himself in a different rhythm, a different posture, a different place in the machine. Jamal still lived in the same apartment, still walked the same route to the corner store, still brewed his coffee with the same battered French press he had carried from Nairobi to Los Angeles in the bottom of a suitcase. But the interior of his life had shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. The living room now contained a custom-built desk, a dual-monitor setup, a bookshelf newly filled with thick legal tomes and international regulatory guides. Next to his keyboard sat a fingerprint-encrypted USB key, gifted by the legal team at Ellerton Media, containing sensitive drafts and internal documents no one else outside their core circle had access to. His mornings began earlier. By 6, he was already reviewing translated documents, contracts drafted in Mandarin, Korean, Portuguese. He read clauses like others read weather reports, checking the atmosphere, predicting storms, identifying what others missed. He had regained his rhythm, the scholar's flow he thought he had buried. The only difference now was that his lecture hall was digital, his chalkboard a screen, his students legal associates from around the world who never heard his voice. He didn't report to the Ellerton Tower, nor did he attend board meetings. He was paid through a discrete contractor agreement, drafted to resemble an international compliance consultant role. Only a few people in the company knew who JAO Linguistics Services referred to, and none of them spoke of it in casual settings. The arrangement suited Jamal perfectly. It offered distance, discretion, and control. Still, changes in the company were beginning to ripple outward, seeded by that one conversation in the car, that one translation that had pulled back the veil. Ellerton Media's internal structure was undergoing what the board called a cultural audit. Brian had hired a new chief people officer, an HR veteran with a reputation for dismantling toxic hierarchies and empowering lower-tier staff. The old culture of sharp jokes, backroom exclusivity, and assumed privilege was being replaced, carefully and methodically, with new values. The staff began to notice. Meetings were no longer peppered with dismissive humor. Managers were required to participate in feedback sessions with non-management employees. Raises and internal promotions were reassessed based on contributions, not visibility. And Brian himself had changed. He was still intense, still driven, but his edges had softened. He began walking through departments he'd previously ignored, striking up real conversations. He no longer asked, "What's your role again?" to new hires. He knew their names. He listened. Most of this Jamal heard secondhand, through private briefings, internal memos, or the quiet words of Diane Wu, who had begun to treat Jamal not just as an asset, but as a colleague. She checked in weekly, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine curiosity about what he had discovered, and he always had something to share. The most recent project involved a South Korean data analytics firm seeking a content-sharing partnership. On the surface, the deal appeared sound. Well-written clauses, mutually beneficial terms, clear language. But Jamal found the fault lines. Not in what was written, but in what was not. Entire operational boundaries were left undefined. Rights to derivative technologies were vaguely described, open to future reinterpretation. And worst of all, a clause referencing third-party ownership through unnamed subsidiaries, a backdoor buried in politeness. He flagged it, wrote a comprehensive assessment, and proposed a redraft. Within 24 hours, Diane called him. "We would have missed that," she said. "Again." "Most would," he replied simply. Her voice dropped. "We can't do this without you." He offered no reply, but the sentiment settled into him like warmth through stone. Outside the demands of his new work, Jamal continued to live modestly. The check Brian had written still remained partially untouched. A large portion had been wired to his sister in Ghana. Tuition for her son, repairs for their mother's home, and medical expenses for their uncle, who had long suffered in silence due to unaffordable care. The rest Jamal held close, divided among quiet investments, small donations to refugee support networks, and a growing fund he had created under an alias. It was called the Silent Ladder, a name that meant nothing to others but everything to him. One day, he hoped, it would become a scholarship for others who had been erased. He never bought a new car. The Escalade was sold back to the Fleet Company. He took meetings now by encrypted Zoom links, or sat at his kitchen table with headphones and a mug of tea, reviewing files while light spilled across the window from a sky that no longer felt so far away. One morning, he received an unexpected email from Brian. The subject line read, "Walking a different road." The body was short. "Jamal, would you consider having lunch with me this week? No agenda, just time. Let me know." Jamal stared at the screen for several seconds before typing a reply. "Yes, Wednesday, noon." They met at a quiet place in Pasadena, far from the city's noise, where the tables were spaced widely and the servers didn't linger too long. Brian arrived on time, dressed down in jeans and a linen shirt. He looked thinner than before, less armored. Jamal, dressed as he always was, neatly but simply, greeted him with a nod. They talked, not about business but about books, about cities they had both visited, about food. Brian mentioned a trip to Kyoto years ago, where he had walked along the philosopher's path. Jamal recalled the university district and the cherry blossoms. It wasn't exactly friendship, but it was something. After lunch, as they stood in the parking lot, Brian said, "I keep thinking about how many people I've passed by without seeing. You cracked that open. You made me look." Jamal said nothing. "I'm trying to get better at it," Brian added. "You're making progress," Jamal said. Brian smiled, a little surprised. "That means a lot." Jamal nodded. "It should." That night, Jamal received a call from Diane. She sounded almost giddy. "We're moving forward with the Brazil deal," she said. "Your revisions passed through both legal teams. The board signed off. They were impressed, is putting it mildly." "I'm glad," Jamal said. "They want to offer you something more permanent," she added. "You'd still stay off the radar if you want, but the scope would expand. You'd be a part of shaping policy, not just reacting to it." "I'll consider it," he replied. And he meant it. He ended the call and turned off the light. the room filled with the soft blue glow of the city beyond the window. Somewhere out there, buildings lit up with artificial fire, people moved in rhythms of ambition and survival, and machines whirred beneath the surface of everything. Jamal sat at his desk, opened the next document, and began to read. There was work to do, and for the first time in years, it felt like it mattered. The package arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a courier in a blue polo shirt who offered a polite nod and vanished down the hallway before Jamal could ask any questions. It was light, but firm in his hands, wrapped in thick cream-colored paper and sealed with a simple silver ribbon. There was no return address, only his name, printed in crisp block letters, not handwritten, on a small white card. He set the package on his desk without opening it. The day was already full. A joint venture agreement between Ellerton Media and a Brazilian tech incubator had just been finalized, and Jamal had spent the better part of the morning reviewing annexes and supplemental terms from both legal teams. They were cleaner than most, thanks in no small part to the revisions he had insisted upon 2 weeks earlier. But still, there were loose edges. Always loose edges. He returned to his notes, brushing the ribbon aside without looking at it again. The work required concentration. 3 clauses referenced an outdated compliance standard that could create a conflict with GDPR interpretation in the EU. It wasn't sabotage, just laziness, the kind that slipped through when drafts passed too quickly from one desk to another. Jamal annotated the sections, added hyperlinks to more recent regulatory code, and flagged the chain of liability if arbitration were ever needed. He wrote without pause, his fingers typing with clarity and intention. It was this focus, more than anything else, that had made him indispensable. By late afternoon, the sky outside had begun to darken, not with rain. Los Angeles rarely offered that mercy, but with a strange humidity that hung low over the city, casting a haze over the distant skyline. Jamal finally leaned back in his chair, rubbed his eyes, and reached again for the unopened package. He untied the ribbon slowly, then removed the paper. Inside was a small black box, the kind typically reserved for plaques or awards. When he opened it, he saw a nameplate nestled in soft velvet. The engraving was sharp, professional, understated. Dr. Jamal A. Okoye, Director of International Linguistics and Cultural Affairs, Ellerton Media Group. Beneath the plate was a handwritten note in Brian's distinct looping script. Your choice whether to use this. Either way, you're seen now. Jamal stared at the nameplate for a long time. He didn't touch it. He didn't smile. But something passed through him, something still and profound. Recognition, perhaps, or its more fragile cousin, acknowledgement. He placed the nameplate back into its box and slid it into the top drawer of his desk. The drawer clicked shut softly. It would stay there for now. That evening, Jamal walked down to the mailbox near the corner grocery. He had a check to send, a payment toward his nephew's first semester at medical school. The envelope had been sealed 2 days ago, addressed and stamped, but he had waited to send it. He wasn't sure why. Now he dropped it into the box and stood still for a moment, watching the envelope disappear into the dark. He returned home by foot, passing a mural he'd seen 1,000 times but never really noticed. It showed a black woman cradling a child in one arm and holding a book in the other, surrounded by swirling patterns of blue and gold. The caption read, "Knowledge is the light we carry." He paused in front of it for longer than he meant to. Back in his apartment, he opened his laptop and checked the secure file share. A new document had been uploaded by Ellerton Media's legal counsel, a preliminary draft of an agreement with a Singapore-based firm specializing in localized AI content moderation. It was long, full of vague sentiment and corporate optimism, with entire paragraphs that sounded promising but said very little. Jamal poured himself a cup of tea and sat down. The first few pages were predictable. Standard language about innovation and partnership, promises of joint development, respect for cultural nuance. But by page 9 he found what he had expected. A cleverly masked provision allowing the Singaporean firm to replicate Ellerton's behavioral prediction model in Southeast Asia without attribution or cost. It was embedded within a regional adaptation clause that looked innocuous, even generous. But it wasn't. He began his annotations. By the time he reached the final page, he had identified 3 separate points of concern. Each one, if overlooked, could allow for data leakage, IP duplication, and revenue dilution. None of them would be flagged by legal AI. They were buried too deep in context. When he finished, he wrote a cover memo summarizing his concerns, added a note that red lines were recommended, and uploaded the annotated file to the server. The following morning, Diane Wu called. Her voice came through clear and purposeful. "We reviewed your notes. You saved us again." "I read carefully," Jamal replied. "You always do. The board wants to increase your scope. Make your position permanent. Confidential still, of course, but with greater influence. They want you advising the strategy team directly." Jamal hesitated. "I know," she added. "You value your space. But think about it. You wouldn't be visible, just involved." "I'll consider it," he said. After they ended the call, he walked to the window. The sky was unusually blue. It had rained overnight, a rare gift in the city, and now everything glistened with the afterwash of storm. Rooftops, streets, the curve of the road below. His world had changed, yet remained outwardly the same. No headlines, no applause. Just the quiet architecture of something better being built. That afternoon, he received a delivery from a bookstore downtown. Inside was a first edition copy of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, sent anonymously, but he suspected it was from Brian. He placed it on his shelf without ceremony. Its spine aligned perfectly with the others. Cambridge texts, Japanese language corpora, a few books he had smuggled out of Nairobi tucked behind them like sacred relics. A week later, a call came from a refugee advocacy nonprofit. They had received a large anonymous donation with instructions to distribute scholarships to displaced scholars seeking credential revalidation in the United States. No name attached, only a small typed phrase on the memo line, "For those made invisible." Jamal knew they wouldn't trace it back to him. That was the point. In time, his work deepened. His name, even if unseen, began to shape documents at the highest levels of Ellerton's international dealings. His insights quietly altered strategies, prevented missteps, and improved outcomes. He remained off the organizational chart, but inside the core. And then, one morning, 3 months later, Jamal stepped into a waiting vehicle outside his building, not as the driver, but as the passenger. Brian was behind the wheel. No chauffeur, no assistant, just him. "Mind if I take you in today?" he asked, half smiling. Jamal raised an eyebrow but climbed in. The city moved past them as they drove. Streets he used to know from behind the wheel now passed by with different meaning. Traffic was slower than usual. Brian didn't seem to mind. At a red light, he looked over. "Are you going to put the nameplate on your door?" "Maybe," Jamal said. Brian nodded. "Whenever you're ready." They drove on. The Ellerton Tower loomed ahead, steel and glass reaching into the sky. Somewhere inside was a small office, windowless by design, where documents lived before the public ever saw them, where clarity was born before press releases were written. It didn't need a name on the door, but one waited in a drawer just in case. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore others on the channel. And don't forget to share